Hey everyone, tonight we are traveling back to the quiet corners of the Middle Ages, to a world where the nights were long, the roofs were thin, and fear was as common as the air itself. Not the fear of monsters or kings, but the small, unspoken worries that shaped every breath of a peasant's life. Imagine it. A narrow village path beneath the faint glow of a moon. Smoke drifts from thatched roofs, the smell of wood and earth heavy in the air. Somewhere a dog barks once, then falls silent. Inside the huts, families huddle close to the hearth, the fire flickering low, its light trembling over faces lined by work and weather. Every creak of timber carries meaning. Was it the wind or something else? Outside, the fields stretch empty and dark, whispering with unseen movement. The forest beyond seems alive, its edges shifting, its silence watchful. No one lingers at the window too long. These were people who feared hunger more than death, sickness more than sin, and silence more than noise. Every shadow, every knock, every toll of the bell could mean change. And change was rarely kind. A missing sheep, a sudden fever, a tax collector's demand. Each could unravel a life carefully held together by prayer and patience. And yet, beneath all that worry, there was still faith, a kind of quiet courage that endured through storms and sickness, through long winters and empty granaries, a belief that dawn would come, even if the world around them didn't seem to promise it. So before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you enjoy these quiet journeys through history as forgotten hearts. And tell me, where are you listening from tonight? Somewhere perhaps the wind is still howling against old wooden walls just as it once did here. Now, close your eyes. Hear the whisper of straw underfoot, the sigh of the wind beyond the door, and the distant ring of a church bell fading into the fog. Let's begin. The story of the secret fears that haunted everyday medieval peasants. The village shadows, fear of the night. As the sun, a tired eye, finally dipped below the distant line of fields, casting the world in a bruised, fading light, a profound transformation occurred for the medieval peasant. The familiar landscape of daily toil, with its visible challenges and known rhythms, gave way to a realm of profound uncertainty and pervasive dread. Fear of the night was not merely a childish fancy, it was a deeply ingrained rational anxiety, for the darkness outside the hut felt alive, filled with wolves, spirits, and thieves, each a potent threat to the fragile thread of existence. You would stand at the low, rough-hewn doorway of your hut, watching the last sliver of daylight vanish, feeling the familiar tightening in your gut. The air, which had held a tenuous warmth during the day, now sharpened, carrying the biting chill that heralded the coming of a long, brutal night. The shadows which had clung to the edges of the forest now stretched long and indistinct, creeping out to claim the fields, the paths, and eventually the very thresholds of your village. The world outside, once a busy tableau of communal life, slowly emptied. Villagers rushed to finish their last chores, their movements hurried, their faces grimly focused. Animals were coaxed into their byres, doors were hastily barred, and windows, often just crude openings, were shuttered tight. Each act was a silent acknowledgement of the night's dangers, a desperate effort to draw the fragile boundaries between safety and peril. The darkness itself was absolute, a profound, suffocating blackness that modern eyes can scarcely imagine. Without artificial light, save for the weak glow of a banked hearth or a precious tallow candle, the world outside became a canvas for the imagination, populated by the most ancient and visceral of fears. Every rustle of leaves, every creak of timber, every distant sound was amplified, charged with potential menace. wolves were a tangible, ever-present threat. Their hunger, sharpened by the scarcity of winter or the pressures of a lean season, made them bold. Their mournful howls, carried on the wind from the deep forest, would send a cold shiver down your spine, freezing your heart. They stalked the edges of the village, their keen senses drawn to the warmth of the animals, the presence of vulnerable life. A missing sheep, a snatched goat. These were devastating losses, often attributed to the silent, cunning hunters of the night. But the night was not just a realm of beasts, it was also the domain of spirits, of malevolent forces that were believed to wax strongest in the profound gloom. Witches, ghosts, mischievous fairies. These were not mere tales told by the fire, but very real dangers. It was believed that spirits could enter the hut through cracks, that witches could cast curses under the cloak of darkness, bringing illness, bad luck, or even death. Night prayers and protective charms, whispered blessings and carefully placed herbs were desperate shields against these unseen evils. And then there were thieves and outlaws, desperate men driven by hunger or greed who used the cover of darkness to prey on the vulnerable. A lone hut, a small village, a careless traveller. These were easy targets. The fear of a sudden, violent intrusion, of losing your meagre possessions, your animals, or even your life, was a constant, gnawing anxiety that kept sleep shallow and restless. You would lie on your straw bed, huddled close to your family, wrapped in your rough woolen blanket, listening intently. Your husband beside you would stir, his hand instinctively reaching for the heavy cudgel or axe kept close by. His vigilance was a shared burden, an unspoken worry that hung in the thick, smoky air. The silence outside was often more terrifying than any specific noise. It was an empty, vast silence, full of unspoken possibilities, broken only by the distant hoot of an owl or the sharp bark of a village dog, its alarm a chilling confirmation of something unseen moving in the shadows. Darkness outside the hut felt alive, filled with wolves, spirits, and thieves. The fear of the night was a pervasive, fundamental anxiety for medieval peasants, transforming their humble dwelling into a fragile fortress and their sleep into a state of perpetual vigilance. It was a haunting reminder that in their world, the setting sun brought not peace, but a long, terrifying confrontation with the unknown, the fragile roof above. For the medieval peasant, the hut was a sanctuary, however humble, a thin but vital barrier against the relentless elements. Its walls of mud and wattle, its packed earth floor, its barred door, all offered a fragile defense. But above all, literally, rested the roof, a crucial shield of thatch against the whims of the sky. And one of the deepest, most persistent fears of daily life was the vulnerability of this roof. A sudden, violent storm could tear through thatch, leaving families shivering, exposed, and soaked, their entire world plunged into a deeper, more immediate kind of terror. You would lie on your straw bed in the deep of the night, perhaps roused by the distant rumble of thunder or the sudden sharp gust of wind. The hut, usually a place of profound quiet, would suddenly become a symphony of unsettling sounds. The wind, a relentless and unseen presence, would begin to sigh and moan around the eaves, rising to a mournful whistle as it probed the cracks and gaps in the thatch. Then the rain would begin. Not a gentle shower, but a relentless deluge, drumming a furious rhythm on the thatched roof. At first, the thatch, thick and dense, would hold fast, its intricate layers absorbing the assault. But then the insidious sound would begin, the drip, drip, drip of water piercing through a weak spot, landing with a chilling plink on a piece of pottery, or a soft, wet smack on the earthen floor. Your heart would clench with dread. Each drip was a separate, chilling announcement of the outside world's intrusion, a declaration of the roof's failure. You could almost feel the cold, damp touch of the water, even before it reached you, sensing its slow, insidious seep. You would lie tense, straining your ears, trying to discern the extent of the breach, praying it was just a small, isolated leak. But a severe storm was a different beast. The wind would become a roaring, howling gale, tearing at the thatch with unseen claws. The old timbers of the roof frame, salvaged and rough-hewn, would groan and creak under its relentless pressure. The rafters, lashed together with rope or held by simple wooden pegs, would protest, their joints moaning with a deep, resonant sound that seemed to vibrate through the very earth beneath you. The fear was visceral. A sudden, terrifying rustle would be followed by the unmistakable sound of thatch being ripped away, pulled free by the wind's immense force. The rain would no longer drip. It would pour, sheeting through the exposed gap, drenching the straw bed, soaking the rough woolen blankets, chilling the very bones of your family. The hut, your sanctuary, would be transformed into a cold, wet, exposed shell. In the midst of such a storm, there was little to be done. To venture outside in the driving rain and howling wind to attempt repairs was folly, a greater danger than the water itself. So you endured it, huddled together with your family, trying to find a dry spot, trying to shield the children, listening to the relentless assault, feeling profoundly vulnerable. The air in the hut, already thick with wood smoke and damp earth, would now become heavy with the pervasive scent of wet straw and saturated timbers. The cold would deepen, an insidious chill that mingled with the dampness, threatening sickness, hypothermia, despair. For the children, roused from sleep by the clamour and the cold, their whimpers would mingle with the roar of the storm. You would pull them closer, murmuring reassurances, but your own heart would be filled with the same terror, the same profound helplessness against the raw, brutal power of nature. A storm could tear through thatch, leaving families shivering and wet. The fragile roof above was a constant source of anxiety for medieval peasants, a stark reminder of their vulnerability to the elements. It was a profound, daily fear, knowing that their most essential shield against the outside world could at any moment be stripped away, plunging their entire existence into a deeper, more immediate kind of terror and the harsh reality of exposure. The hunger season. For the medieval peasant, life was an unrelenting battle against scarcity, but no period encapsulated this struggle more profoundly than the hunger season. Every winter carried with it a gnawing dread, a cold certainty that began to tighten in the gut as the days shortened and the last harvest was brought in. It was the fear of empty granaries and gnawing stomachs, a spectral presence that haunted every waking hour and permeated the restless sleep, a stark reminder of life lived on the precipice. As the leaves withered and fell and the first biting winds swept in from the north, the anxiety would begin its slow, insidious creep. The granary, the physical manifestation of your family's hope, would be carefully inspected. Its bins, once overflowing with the golden bounty of barley and rye, were now slowly dwindling, a visual countdown to potential disaster. Every grain consumed was a calculated loss, every meal a careful negotiation with the future. The gnawing ache in your stomach was a constant companion, a dull, insistent pain that began with the first light of dawn and would persist throughout the long, arduous day, through the restless hours of night. It was a hunger so profound that it consumed every thought, every action, every decision. The simple act of obtaining enough food to survive the next day was now the overriding purpose of existence. Meals shrank to pitiful portions. Breakfast might be a single, small piece of stale bread, made from whatever coarse grain could be found, bulked out with husks or even finely ground bark. It was hard, tasteless, and provided only a fleeting, unsatisfying mouthful. The main meal, usually a thick pottage, was reduced to a thin broth, its liquid watery and devoid of substance. A few withered roots, a handful of wild greens gathered from neglected verges, perhaps a single dried pea. These were the precious, almost invisible ingredients that floated in the lukewarm liquid. For the children, the hunger was even more cruel. Their small bodies, already fragile, wasted away quickly. Their faces became gaunt, their eyes hollow, their small cries of hunger echoing through the hut. You would offer them your own portion, trying to give them what little sustenance you had, but it was never enough. The sight of their suffering was a constant, heartbreaking torment, magnifying your own profound helplessness. The search for food extended far beyond the traditional fields. You would scavenge the fringes of the frozen forest for edible roots and berries, dig desperately in the hardened earth for anything that might sustain. You would watch for small game, a desperate hunt for a rabbit or a bird, but the wild, too, struggled in the lean months. The world itself seemed to offer nothing but scarcity. The silence of the hunger season was profound. The usual sounds of village life, laughter, cheerful banter, robust activity, would be muted, replaced by a pervasive lethargy, a quiet desperation. The energy simply wasn't there. People moved slowly, conserved their strength, their conversations hushed, filled with unspoken anxieties. Dreams, when they came, were often cruel visions of food, of feasts, of tables overflowing with abundance, only to vanish with the brutal awakening to an empty belly. Night after night, the mind would tantalize with what the body so desperately craved, turning sleep itself into a torment. Every winter carried the dread of empty granaries and gnawing stomachs. The hunger season was not just a period of scarcity, it was a profound existential fear that gripped medieval peasants, a constant, chilling reminder of their utter vulnerability to the whims of nature and the fragility of their agrarian existence. It was a haunting, relentless shadow that defined their lives, dictating every desperate struggle for survival day after agonizing day. The church bell's warning. In the medieval village, the church bell was more than just a timepiece or a call to prayer. It was the voice of the community, a sonic thread weaving through the fabric of daily life. It marked the passage of hours, celebrated births and weddings, and tolled for deaths. But in an age of profound uncertainty and constant peril, the church bell also served as a stark, chilling warning. Each toll could signal fire, death, or an imminent danger on the horizon, sending a jolt of terror through the peasant's heart. You would be in your hut, huddled with your family by the dwindling fire, the long, dark hours of night pressing in. The silence within, broken only by the whisper of the wind and the anxious breathing of your children, would be a fragile peace. Then, cutting through the heavy air, it would begin. A solitary, deep clang. Then, after a long, agonizing pause, another, and another, slow, deliberate. Each sound vibrated through the very earth, penetrating the thick walls of your hut, gripping your heart with a cold, unrelenting dread. The bell was no longer a comforting sound, it was an alarm, a death knell, a messenger of misfortune. The village priest, or his designated bell ringer, understood the weight of his duty. He knew the specific rhythms and patterns of the tolls, the silent code that conveyed the nature of the warning. 3 swift, frantic peals could mean fire, sending villagers rushing out into the night, desperate to save what little they possessed. A slower, more measured series of tolls, perhaps 3 for a child, 9 for an adult, was the dreaded death knell. bringing the abstract fear of mortality into stark personal focus. Your heart would clench. You would lie absolutely motionless, straining your ears into the profound quiet that followed each chime. The silence between the tolls felt immense, heavy, filled with unspoken questions and terrifying possibilities. Who had it claimed? Which family had been struck anew by loss or misfortune? What fresh danger had arrived? The cold of the night would feel sharper, more insidious, imbued with the terror of the bell's message. The warmth of the banked fire, the collective warmth of bodies, would seem suddenly insufficient against the chilling pronouncement of disaster. The shuttered walls of the hut, usually a sanctuary, now felt porous, allowing the dread to seep in unchecked. Sometimes the warning would not be of fire or death, but of a different kind of danger. A frantic, irregular pealing might signal an attack, bandits on the road, raiders approaching the village, or the sudden, terrifying approach of desperate soldiers. Such a sound would send the village into a panic, forcing families to prepare for immediate flight or desperate defense, huddling their children, burying their few valuables. Your husband might rise, restless and uneasy. He would move to the door, his hand on the heavy bar, listening intently into the night. His vigil was one of helpless apprehension, a shared burden with every other family in the village. There was nothing to be done in the deep darkness, no way to ascertain the specific tragedy until the light of day. Only to listen and to wait. The children, if they woke, would be soothed with vague, whispered reassurances, but the fear in your own voice would be hard to disguise. Their small minds would struggle to comprehend the grim message, but their bodies would register the pervasive anxiety of their parents. Each toll could signal fire, death, or danger on the horizon. The church bell's warning was a constant, haunting sound that defined the secret fears of everyday medieval peasants. It was a profound communal pronouncement of peril, a chilling soundtrack to a world teetering on the edge of uncertainty, where every chime brought a fresh wave of dread, reinforcing their fragile thread of life and the ever-present shadow of misfortune. The Lord's demand. For the medieval peasant, life was not merely a struggle against nature's harshness, it was also a ceaseless submission to the unyielding authority of their feudal lord. His presence, often unseen but always profoundly felt, cast a long shadow over every aspect of their existence. And one of the deepest, most persistent fears of daily life was the Lord's demand. A sudden knock at the door could mean taxes, forced labor, or worse, an arbitrary decree that could shatter a family's fragile security and bring ruin in an instant. You would be in your hut, perhaps trying to coax warmth from the dwindling embers, or sharing a meager meal with your family. The long, hard day might be ending, and the promise of a restless sleep beckoned. Then a sharp, authoritative knock would echo from your door. It was not the familiar rap of a neighbor seeking comfort or trade, but a heavy, demanding thud that spoke of official business, of unquestioned power. Your heart would instantly pound with apprehension. To ignore such a summons was unthinkable. It invited immediate and severe retribution. Pushing aside the heavy hide curtain or unbarring the rough wooden door, you would face the Lord's representative, the bailiff, the reeve, or perhaps even a lower-ranking guard. His face, often stern and unyielding, betrayed no sympathy for your evident privation. His thick cloak, though perhaps worn, still spoke of a comfort and authority far removed from your own. He was flanked, often by armed retainers, their spears glinting dully in the fading light, their presence a stark reminder of the power they represented. His demands would be delivered in a cold, unwavering voice without preamble or explanation. Perhaps it was a fresh levy of taxes, a portion of your precious grain, a few eggs, a valuable chicken, or even a newborn piglet. These were not requests but commands exacted even when your own granary was near empty and your children's bellies cried with hunger. The burden of feudal obligation was absolute, a crushing weight that continued to extract its due even as your life ebbed away. Or perhaps it was a demand for labour, an unexpected call for communal work on the Lord S lands, clearing ditches, repairing fences, or building new structures. This meant sacrificing your own precious time, neglecting your own small plot, further jeopardizing your family's precarious survival. To refuse was to invite punishment, a public beating, the seizure of precious tools, or the burning of your hut, leaving your family utterly destitute. Sometimes the demand could be even worse. A young man called to serve in the Lord's distant wars, perhaps never to return. A young woman demanded for service in the manor house, her fate uncertain, her connection to her family severed. These were arbitrary decrees that tore at the very fabric of family, shattering lives with a single, cold command. You and your husband would meet the demand with grim, stoic faces, a quiet, deep-seated resignation. There would be no argument, no open defiance, only a murmuring of acknowledgement, a collective bowing of heads. The fear of retribution was a powerful motivator, overriding the desperation born of hunger and cold. The knowledge that your fate lay not in your own hands, but in the arbitrary will of another, was a constant, chilling burden. A knock at the door could mean taxes, labour, or worse. The Lord's demand was a pervasive, fundamental fear for medieval peasants, transforming their humble dwelling into a place where security was always conditional, and their lives were perpetually subject to the whims of their powerful master. It was a haunting reminder that in their world, power was absolute, and their very existence was a precarious balance between the harshness of nature and the unyielding demands of their feudal overlords. Work and worry. The failing harvest. For the medieval peasant, the rhythm of life was entirely dictated by the land. Every waking hour, every aching muscle, every hopeful prayer was invested in the fields, in the promise of the harvest. It was the linchpin of survival, the fragile bulwark against hunger and cold. Thus, one of the deepest, most pervasive fears was the failing harvest. Crops might rot in the field or wither on the stalk, leaving despair where hope had been so painstakingly sown, threatening an entire family's, an entire village's very existence. The dread would begin subtly with unusual weather patterns that defied the familiar cycles. Too much rain in spring, turning the fields into muddy bogs where seeds rotted before they could sprout. Too little sun in summer, leaving the green shoots stunted and pale. A sudden, unexpected frost in late spring or early autumn, blackening delicate young plants overnight. Each anomaly was observed with a tightening gut, a growing sense of foreboding. You would walk through your fields, your heart heavy, your eyes scanning the rows with a desperate professional gaze. Where the grain should be tall and golden, heavy with the promise of kernels, it was thin, sparse, its heads small and barely filled. The stalks, instead of standing defiant against the wind, might lie flattened by a sudden storm, their precious bounties soaking into the damp earth, destined to rot. The smell of the fields, usually rich with the promise of growth, now carried an unsettling tang of decay. The sight of your neighbour's fields mirroring your own offered no comfort, only a shared, profound despair. The communal hope, once so vibrant, slowly gave way to a collective, grim understanding the harvest was failing. The work, usually performed with grim determination, now felt futile, infused with a deep sense of wasted effort. You would still tend the fields, of course, pulling weeds, scaring away birds, praying for a miraculous recovery. But each movement was heavy, each effort a desperate gamble against overwhelming odds. The sun, a pale, indifferent eye, beat down on your back, offering no succor, only a stark illumination of the impending disaster. As the time for harvest arrived, the reality would be undeniable. The yield would be pitiful, barely enough to cover the seed for the next year, let alone feed your family through the long, lean months. The process of harvesting, usually a time of communal gathering and weary celebration, would be imbued with a profound sorrow. Heads would be bowed, hands moving slowly, gathering the few meager stalks, each one a tangible piece of dwindling hope. The granary, usually a source of comfort, would now echo hollow, its bins remaining tragically empty. The gnawing ache in your stomach, a constant companion even in good times, would now intensify, becoming a relentless, burning torment. The spectre of famine, always lurking on the periphery of medieval life, would move to the forefront, a terrifying, unavoidable reality. Despair, a heavy, suffocating blanket, would settle over the village. The laughter of children would be muted, replaced by a pervasive quiet. The conversations of neighbors would be hushed, filled with unspoken anxieties and grim calculations for the future. The fear of hunger, of cold, of sickness that followed malnutrition, these were the chilling consequences of the failing harvest. Crops might rot in the field, leaving despair where hope had been sown. The failing harvest was one of the deepest, most pervasive fears for medieval peasants, a profound testament to their utter vulnerability to the whims of nature and the precariousness of their agrarian existence. It was a haunting, relentless shadow that defined their lives, dictating every desperate struggle for survival, knowing that their very existence hinged on the unpredictable bounty of the land. The stolen sheep. For the medieval peasant, wealth was not measured in coins, but in land, in tools, and most crucially, in livestock. A single sheep was more than just an animal. It was a living asset, a source of wool for warm clothing, milk for nourishment, and, in dire times, meat for sustenance. It represented a significant portion of a family's fragile security. Thus, one of the most potent visceral fears was the stolen sheep. A missing animal could ruin a family, sparking profound suspicion among neighbors, turning desperate eyes inward and threatening the very fabric of communal trust. You would wake in the cold pre-dawn, perhaps to the frantic barking of your thin cur, or to an uneasy silence from the byre. A sudden, sickening dread would grip your gut. Rushing out, your heart pounding, you would find the gate ajar, or a gap in the crude fence. Your sheep, or one of your few precious sheep, was gone. The shock was immediate, profound. It was not just an animal that was lost, it was a piece of your family's future, a vital thread in the fragile tapestry of your survival. The wool for the winter's cloaks, the potential lambs for a new flock, the emergency source of meat, all gone, vanished into the night. The economic blow was catastrophic, threatening to push an already precarious family into utter destitution. Your immediate reaction would be a desperate search. You would follow the tracks in the mud or the snow, your eyes scanning the ground, hoping to find a stray, to trace a path. But invariably, the tracks would lead to the edge of the forest, or disappear onto a frozen path, swallowed by the vast, indifferent darkness that held so many secrets. Then the fear would curdle into suspicion. Who in the village, or the neighboring hamlets, would be so desperate, so cruel, as to steal from a struggling family? The community, usually a source of mutual support, now became a landscape of wary glances and hushed whispers. Every neighbor, every casual acquaintance became a potential suspect. You would eye the hut of a less fortunate family, wondering if their fire burned a little brighter, if a faint, unfamiliar smell of meat lingered in the air. The gossip would begin, subtle and insidious, weaving through the village like a poisonous vine. Accusations, unspoken but palpable, would create profound rifts, shattering the fragile bonds of trust that were so essential for collective survival. The sheriff, if he deigned to investigate, would offer little comfort. His justice was often slow, inefficient, and biased towards the powerful. The Lord, if he heard, might levy a fine, further deepening your family's plight. True recourse was rare. The fear was not just of the immediate loss, but of the wider implications. A desperate thief was a dangerous thief. Could they return? Could they grow bolder? The security of your other animals and even your family felt profoundly compromised. The night, already a realm of terror, became even more menacing. For the children, the stolen sheep was a stark, brutal lesson in the precariousness of their world. They understood, implicitly, the devastating impact of such a loss, the deepened shadow of hunger that now fell upon their own bellies. A missing animal could ruin a family, sparking suspicion among neighbors. The stolen sheep was one of the deepest, most visceral fears of everyday medieval peasants, a profound testament to their utter vulnerability to both the elements and the desperation of others. It was a haunting, pervasive anxiety that defined their lives, reminding them that their very survival hinged not only on the bounty of the land, but on the fragile, often tested bonds of trust within their own community. The broken tool. For the medieval peasant, life was defined by ceaseless labor, and that labor was utterly dependent on a few simple tools: a plough, a hoe, a scythe, an axe. These were not mere implements, they were extensions of the body, irreplaceable partners in the struggle against the land. Thus, one of the most immediate and profound fears was the broken tool. A snapped plough or a rusted hoe was not an inconvenience to be swiftly remedied. It was a disaster, threatening to halt all work, crippling a family's ability to feed itself, and casting a long shadow of ruin. You would be in the field, perhaps, on a cold spring morning, your back already aching, your hands gripping the rough wooden handles of the plough, the scrawny ox strained against its yoke, turning over the stubborn earth. Then, with a sudden, sickening crack, the wooden beam of the plough would splinter, or its iron share would snap, hitting a hidden stone. The work would grind to a sudden, catastrophic halt. The shock was immediate, a cold dread seizing your gut. Your hands would tremble as you inspected the damage. The broken tool lay there, a stark, inanimate symbol of profound disaster. Your means of working the land, your primary way of securing food for your family, was suddenly, irrevocably gone. This was not a problem that could be easily solved. There was no village shop to buy a new plough, no spare parts readily available. Timber had to be painstakingly gathered from the distant, often sparse, forests, then laboriously worked into shape. Iron, the metal for the share, was precious, its procurement a matter of arduous trade or desperate scavenging, and its reshaping the difficult task of the village blacksmith, whose skills were in high demand and whose services commanded a heavy price in kind. Every hour, every day that the plough lay broken was a day lost in the relentless race against the seasons. The planting would be delayed, the vital window for sowing the seed slipping away. A delayed harvest meant a reduced yield, a sharper hunger in the coming winter. The very act of living, already precarious, became infinitely more so. Your husband's face, when he saw the damage, would be a mask of grim despair. The silence between you would be heavy, filled with unspoken anxieties, with the crushing weight of this fresh burden. The children, sensing the tension, would grow quiet. their small faces reflecting the fear in their parents' eyes. They understood, implicitly, the profound significance of a broken tool. The thought of going to the blacksmith, of negotiating the exchange of precious grain, or a portion of your meager livestock for his services, was another source of profound worry. His price, however fair, was a substantial sacrifice, further depleting your already dwindling stores. The repair itself would take time you desperately could not afford to lose. The fear was not just of the immediate physical loss, but of the cascading consequences. Without a plough, the field could not be fully worked. Without a proper field, the harvest would fail. Without a harvest, there would be no food, no means to pay the Lord's taxes, no way to survive the winter. The broken tool was a tangible threat to the very survival of your family. A snapped plough or rusted hoe was a disaster, not an inconvenience. The broken tool was one of the deepest, most pervasive fears of everyday medieval peasants, a profound testament to their utter vulnerability to the smallest misfortune. It was a haunting, relentless shadow that defined their daily toil, reminding them that their fragile existence hinged not only on the bounty of the land, but on the constant, unwavering functioning of the few, precious implements that allowed them to coax life from the unforgiving earth. The watchful forest. For the medieval peasant, the forest was an indispensable, yet profoundly ambiguous presence. It was the source of vital firewood, of building timber, of wild game, and of foraging opportunities. It was an essential resource that bordered every village, a stark, imposing presence at the edge of their known, cultivated world. But for all its bounty, the forest was also a realm of deep, ancient fears. Trees stood as borders to the unknown, hiding both game and profound danger, a constant, watchful entity that stirred the deepest anxieties of daily life. You would venture into the forest almost daily, a necessary pilgrimage for survival. You carried your crude axe or a stout staff, your eyes constantly scanning, trained by years of necessity to discern the subtle signs of its hidden life. The air in the forest was different, damp, cool, carrying the pungent scent of decaying leaves, wet earth, and the subtle tang of wildness. Even in daylight, the canopy of branches, thick and often tangled, allowed only a dappled, hesitant light to filter through, creating a perpetual twilight that felt both mysterious and unsettling. The trees themselves were immense, ancient, their gnarled branches reaching like skeletal fingers towards the sky. They stood as silent, unmoving sentinels, forming a dense, impenetrable border between the human world of the village and the untamed wilderness. This border was more than just physical. It was a psychological and spiritual frontier, a place where the rules of man often gave way to the primal laws of nature and the unseen forces of the spirit world. The fear of the forest was multifaceted. It was the fear of getting lost, of becoming disoriented in its vast, trackless depths, particularly as dusk began to fall. An hour's wander could turn into a night's deadly exposure, a journey from which many never returned. The forest was cunning, its paths easily obscured by undergrowth, its clearings quickly swallowed by new growth. Then there was the fear of its wild inhabitants. Wolves, bears, wild boars. These were not distant creatures of legend, but very real, very dangerous animals whose hunger, sharpened by the lean seasons, made them bold. Their tracks, often seen in the snow or mud, were a chilling reminder of their presence. A sudden rustle in the undergrowth, a distant snap of a twig, a mournful howl carried on the wind. These sounds would send a jolt of terror through your body, quickening your pace, making your heart pound. But the forest also hid human dangers, outlaws, bandits, desperate vagrants, or even banished men seeking refuge. These individuals, operating beyond the reach of the Lord's law, often made their lairs in the deeper, more remote parts of the woods. An unexpected encounter could mean robbery, injury, or death, leaving your family utterly destitute. Beyond the tangible threats, the forest was also believed to be a realm of spirits and magical forces. Witches were said to gather in its darkest clearings, malevolent fairies to lure travelers astray, and ancient pagan gods to linger in its oldest trees. Protective charms, whispered prayers, and the constant awareness of invisible dangers were essential when venturing into its depths. You would work quickly, gathering your firewood, foraging for nuts or berries, ever vigilant. Your eyes would constantly scan the periphery, your ears acutely tuned to every sound. The feeling of being watched, even if unseen, was constant. The trees, silent and towering, seemed to observe your every move, their ancient presence imbued with a subtle, unsettling power. Trees stood as borders to the unknown, hiding both game and danger. The watchful forest was a pervasive, fundamental fear for medieval peasants, transforming an essential resource into a realm of profound anxiety. It was a haunting reminder that their fragile existence was constantly shadowed by the untamed wild, a frontier of both sustenance and terrifying peril that demanded constant vigilance and respect day after arduous day. The river's peril. For the medieval peasant, the river was an indispensable yet profoundly ambiguous presence. It was a source of vital water for drinking, cooking and washing, a pathway for trade, and the power that drove the village mill. But for all its life-giving bounty, the river was also a realm of deep, ancient fears. Crossings meant the risk of floods, the potential for sickness carried by its waters, or the sudden, terrifying grip of drowning, a constant peril woven into the fabric of daily life. You would approach the river with a mixture of reverence and apprehension. Its waters, usually flowing with a steady, rhythmic murmur, carried the subtle scent of damp earth and living things. The sounds it made, the gentle lapping against the banks, the rush of rapids, the creak of the mill wheel, were familiar, yet also held an undercurrent of untamed power. The fear of floods was a seasonal dread. After prolonged rains or the sudden melting of winter snows, the river would swell, its waters rising with terrifying speed, bursting its banks. Its once familiar course would vanish, replaced by a raging brown torrent that could sweep away crops, animal enclosures, and even entire huts. The memory of past floods with their devastating destruction and the loss of life was a chilling, pervasive anxiety that returned with every heavy downpour. Crossing the river was an act fraught with immediate danger. If there was a bridge, it was often a crude, rickety structure of rough-hewn timber, its planks slippery with moss and dampness, its supports groaning underfoot. A misstep, a rotting beam, a sudden gust of wind, these could send a person plunging into the swift, cold current. If there was no bridge, you would have to ford the river, wading through its icy waters, the current pulling at your legs, the uneven stones of its bed treacherous beneath your feet. The fear of being swept away, of losing precious tools or children to its relentless embrace was constant. The river was also believed to be a source of sickness. The water, though vital, was often contaminated by upstream villages, by animal waste, or by the unburied dead during times of plague. Drinking its untreated waters carried the risk of dysentery, fever, and other debilitating ailments. You would fetch it, of course, but often with a silent prayer, hoping that boiling or brewing it into weak ale would somehow purify its unseen dangers. Beyond the practical dangers, the river held a more ancient, mystical dread. It was believed to be the domain of water spirits, of malevolent forces that could drag unwary travelers beneath its surface. Stories of sudden drownings, of bodies never recovered, of strange lights seen flickering on its banks. These were whispered by the hearth, instilling a profound respect and fear for its untamed power. For the children, the river was a place of both fascination and fear. They were taught from a young age to respect its power, to avoid its swift currents, to understand its potential for both life and death. Their play by its banks was always supervised, always cautious. You would approach its banks, your gaze sweeping its surface, assessing its flow, its currents, its potential dangers. Your hands, calloused and rough, would grip the bucket tightly, drawing water with a mix of gratitude and apprehension. The sounds of the river, its ceaseless murmur, its occasional roar, were familiar but also held a constant chilling reminder of its profound and often lethal power. Crossings meant risk of floods, sickness, or sudden drowning. The river's peril was a pervasive, fundamental fear for medieval peasants, transforming an essential resource into a realm of profound anxiety. It was a haunting reminder that their fragile existence was constantly shadowed by the untamed forces of nature, a source of both sustenance and terrifying peril that demanded constant vigilance and respect, day after arduous day. The threat of others. The sheriff's word. In the medieval village, order was a fragile construct, perpetually vulnerable to the whims of nature, the desperation of man, and the arbitrary power of the Lord. And the tangible, daily manifestation of that power was the sheriff, the Lord's local representative. His word was law, his presence often more feared than welcomed. Authority arrived not as protection, but often as punishment, his commands serving to enforce the rigid hierarchy, frequently at the expense of the struggling peasant, and deepening their pervasive, secret fears. The sheriff, often a local landowner or a trusted retainer of the Lord, embodied the secular power that governed the peasant's existence. He was a visible presence in the village. His authority derived from the formidable might of the manor, his word the unquestioned law of the land. His visits were rarely welcome, for they typically brought new demands, fresh taxes, stern warnings, or a summons to face justice. You would be in your hut, perhaps trying to coax warmth from the dwindling embers or sharing a meager meal with your family. Then, a sudden, authoritative knocking would echo from your door. It was not the familiar rap of a neighbor, but a heavy, demanding thud that spoke of official business, of unquestioned power. Your heart would instantly pound with apprehension. To ignore such a summons was unthinkable. It meant immediate and severe retribution. Pushing aside the heavy hide curtain or unbarring the rough wooden door, you would face the sheriff, a formidable figure in his thick woolen cloak, perhaps with a crude sword at his hip, flanked by a few armed retainers. Their faces, often stern and unyielding, betrayed no sympathy for your evident privation. The cold air, sharp and brutal, would rush into your hut, a swift reminder of the world they represented. His commands would be delivered in a cold, unwavering voice, often without preamble or explanation. Perhaps it was a fresh levy of taxes demanded in grain, eggs, or even a portion of your diminishing livestock to support the Lord's needs. Perhaps it was an order for communal labor, for peasants to clear a frozen road to the manor, or to help repair a broken mill, or to join a hunting party in the dangerous snow-choked forest. Or perhaps more grimly, it was a summons to justice, a neighbor accused of theft, a dispute over land, a transgression against the Lord's law. The sheriff's justice was swift and often brutal, dispensed without much recourse, serving as a stark reminder of who held true power. There was no room for appeal, no avenue for protest. To question the sheriff's command was to question the Lord's authority, an act of rebellion that would be met with swift and brutal punishment. You had seen the consequences, public beatings, the seizure of precious tools, or even the burning of a hut, leaving a family utterly destitute in the face of the merciless winter. You and your fellow villagers would meet the sheriff's word with grim, stoic faces, a quiet, deep-seated resignation. There would be no argument, no open defiance, only a murmuring of acknowledgement, a collective bowing of heads. The fear of retribution was a powerful motivator, overriding the desperation born of hunger and cold. The knowledge that your fate lay not in your own hands but in the arbitrary will of another was a constant, chilling burden. Authority arrived not as protection, but often as punishment. The sheriff's word was a pervasive, fundamental fear for medieval peasants, transforming their humble dwelling into a place where security was always conditional, and their lives were perpetually subject to the whims of their powerful master. It was a haunting reminder that in their world, power was absolute, and their very existence was a precarious balance between the harshness of nature and the unyielding, often cruel demands of their earthly overlords. The bandit's knife, in the fragmented and often lawless landscape of medieval Europe, particularly when hunger sharpened desperation, the roads were not merely pathways but perilous gauntlets. Villages were isolated, the Lord's law often distant or ineffective, and the cover of thick forests provided ample hiding places. For the peasant, this meant one of the deepest, most visceral fears was the bandit's knife. Roads were narrow, forests thick. Travelers feared ambush with every step, their journey a constant gamble against violence and sudden brutal loss. You would be making a rare, desperate journey, perhaps to a distant mill with a few handfuls of grain, or to a market to try and trade a prized hand-spun wool blanket for something edible. The cold would be biting, the path treacherous, your body weakened by chronic hunger. The necessity of the journey outweighed the profound, gnawing fear, but it never banished it. The road itself, usually a faint track worn by a few carts, was now often overgrown, its edges swallowed by encroaching undergrowth. It wound through dense woodlands, climbed over lonely hills, or skirted the edges of desolate, abandoned fields. The very narrowness of the path, the thick cover of trees, made it ideal for ambush. Every turn, every shadow, every stand of trees became a potential hiding place for danger. You would walk with heightened senses, your head turning constantly, scanning the shadows, the edges of the frozen woods, the rise and fall of the terrain. Every rustle of leaves, every distant snap of a twig, every unusual bird call became a potential warning sign. Your heart would pound with apprehension, your hand instinctively clutching the rough wooden staff you carried, its weight a meagre comfort. Bandits were not merely common thieves, they were desperate men, often former soldiers, landless peasants driven to crime by starvation, or outlaws seeking refuge in the wilderness. They knew the roads, the hiding places, the times of passage. Their hunger, sharper than your own, drove them to violence, their methods brutal and swift. The fear was of the sudden, silent ambush, a shadow detaching itself from the trees, a crude weapon appearing from behind a snowdrift, a harsh, guttural command. There would be no time for negotiation, no chance for appeal. The glint of a crude knife, the cold steel against your throat, would be the chilling reality of their presence. They would take whatever you possessed, your meager sack of grain, the wool blanket intended for trade, the last few coins you might have hidden. To resist meant a beating, a serious injury, or even death, leaving your family utterly destitute and vulnerable. You would surrender your precious goods with a heavy heart, the bitter taste of injustice mingling with the cold dread of the moment. The encounter would leave you shaken, trembling, your journey interrupted, your hopes dashed. The physical pain of a rough shove, the searing sting of cold where a scarf was ripped away, these were small wounds compared to the profound sense of violation, the crushing despair of losing what little you had. The landscape would seem even more bleak, more hostile, infused with the memory of violence. Roads were narrow, Forests thick, travelers feared ambush with every step. The bandit's knife was a pervasive, fundamental fear for medieval peasants, transforming every journey into a perilous gamble against the threat of violence and sudden, brutal loss. It was a haunting reminder that in their world, safety was a luxury rarely afforded, and the true cost of moving beyond the fragile security of their village was a constant, terrifying confrontation with the desperation and cruelty of others. The stranger's shadow. In the medieval peasant's insular world, where life was bound to the familiar rhythms of the village and the unchanging faces of neighbors, the arrival of a stranger was rarely a cause for celebration. Instead, it stirred a profound mix of suspicion, gossip, and unease. In a time of constant scarcity, limited communication, and pervasive dangers, a newcomer in the village cast a long, unsettling shadow, embodying a host of secret fears, from the threat of theft and violence to the insidious spread of disease or unfamiliar ideas. You would first notice them as a solitary figure, perhaps trudging down the abandoned road that led to your village, their forms silhouetted against the pale sky. Or perhaps they would appear suddenly at the village well, their presence a jarring intrusion into the familiar routine. They were not from your community. Their clothes, their accent, their very bearing would mark them as other. The initial reaction was often a collective, hushed curiosity, quickly followed by suspicion. Who are they? Where did they come from? Why were they here? In a world where every mouth needed to be fed from a precarious food supply, an extra person was a potential drain on scarce resources. In a world where disease traveled stealthily, a stranger was a potential carrier of sickness, bringing plague or fever into a fragile community. Gossip would spread like wildfire through the village, whispered behind cupped hands, exchanged over low fires. Every detail of the stranger's appearance, their few words, their mannerisms, would be scrutinized, discussed, and interpreted through a lens of fear and apprehension. Was their gaze shifty? Did they carry a hidden weapon? Did their presence coincide with any recent misfortune, a stolen chicken, a blighted crop, a sudden illness? The village elders, and certainly the Lord's Reeve or the sheriff, would regard the stranger with deep caution. They might be questioned, their purpose demanded, their movements watched. Medieval society was not one of easy mobility. People were generally tied to their land, their lord. A person without a clear connection, without a master, was inherently suspect, potentially an outlaw, a bandit, or worse. You would keep your children close, admonishing them to avoid contact, to speak no words to the newcomer. Your hut's door would be barred tighter at night, your few possessions guarded more fiercely. The familiar security of your small world felt profoundly disrupted by this unknown presence. The stranger's shadow also carried the fear of unfamiliar ideas. They might bring news from distant, turbulent lands, of wars, of famines, of social unrest, unsettling the quiet conformity of village life. They might speak of different customs, different beliefs, challenging the established order, stirring discontent. Such outside influences in a deeply conservative society were often seen as dangerous, a threat to the stability of the community. Sometimes the fears would prove unfounded. The stranger might be a lone pilgrim, a desperate refugee seeking a new life, or a traveling craftsman. They might prove to be harmless, even a source of news or a rare skill. But the initial suspicion, once kindled, was difficult to extinguish. A newcomer in the village stirred suspicion, gossip, and unease. The stranger's shadow was a pervasive, fundamental fear for medieval peasants, transforming their insular world into a place where security was always conditional, and their lives were perpetually vulnerable to the unpredictable influences of the outside. It was a haunting reminder that in their isolated communities, the unknown was always viewed with profound apprehension, a potential harbinger of danger, disease, or unwelcome change. The Soldier's March. In the medieval world, the peasant's life was tethered to the land, their existence defined by its cycles and its precarious bounty. But far removed from their quiet struggles, the larger, violent forces of the age played out, the endless wars, the shifting loyalties of lords, the ambitions of kings. And one of the deepest, most terrifying fears was the soldier's march. Passing armies, whether friend or foe, stripped fields bare and left nothing but ashes, a devastating, brutal reminder of the peasant's utter powerlessness in the face of organized violence. The news would travel ahead, usually as a desperate rumor whispered by a fleeing farmer or a terrified peddler. An army was on the move. The dread that swept through the village was immediate and absolute. It mattered little if they were your lord's men or the enemy's. Soldiers, regardless of banner, were a consuming force, a plague of a different kind. You would scramble to prepare, a frantic, desperate effort to hide anything of value. Precious grain, painstakingly stored in the granary, would be buried in secret caches in the earth, its location marked only by memory. Livestock, your family's wealth, would be driven deep into the forest or hidden in remote thickets. A desperate gamble against wolves and the soldier's keen eyes. Tools, the very means of your survival, would be hidden under straw, buried under floors. Then the waiting would begin. Huddled in your cottage behind barred doors and shuttered windows, listening intently. The distant rumble of many footsteps, the low thud of drums, the faint glint of steel. These were the terrifying harbingers of their approach. The ground itself might tremble slightly under the weight of hundreds of marching men and horses. The soldiers, when they arrived, were a force of overwhelming power and discipline, or often a chaotic, hungry mob. They would pour into the village, their loud voices, their harsh laughter, their clanking armor a stark contrast to the profound silence that had gripped the community. They came not to protect, but to consume. Their first stop would be the fields. Standing crops, the promise of the next harvest, would be trampled underfoot or cut down indiscriminately for fodder. Barns and granaries would be ransacked, their contents swiftly taken, leaving behind only dust and despair. Animals not successfully hidden would be slaughtered on the spot, their meat roasting over hastily built fires, their hides stripped. They would demand food, drink, women, and shelter. To refuse was to invite brutal retribution. Your cottage might be invaded, your meager possessions taken, your few remaining stores consumed. Windows would be smashed, doors splintered, the fragile sanctuary of your home violated. The threat of violence, of rape, of death hung heavy in the air. The aftermath of a soldier's march was often utter devastation. Fields, stripped bare, lay like a wasteland, unable to feed anyone for the coming season. What little had been hidden might be discovered. The few animals that had been spared might be too weakened by cold and hunger to survive. Cottages might be left in ruins or, worse, put to the torch, leaving behind nothing but ashes and the bitter stench of destruction. You would emerge from hiding or from your violated hut to survey the devastation, your heart heavy with despair. The silence that followed their departure was profound, not one of peace, but of utter desolation. The memory of their passage, of the rapacious hunger, the casual brutality, the utter destruction would be etched deep into your mind. Passing armies stripped fields bare and left nothing but ashes. The soldier's march was a pervasive, fundamental fear for medieval peasants, a profound testament to their utter powerlessness in the face of organized violence. It was a haunting reminder that in their world, Their existence was perpetually vulnerable, their labor easily undone, their very lives subject to the destructive whims of distant lords and the marching boots of men. The outlaws return. In the harsh, unforgiving world of medieval peasants, justice was often crude, brutal, and deeply personal. To be declared an outlaw was to be stripped of all legal protection, cast out from the community, condemned to a life beyond the law, a spectral existence in the fringes of society. But for the villagers who had known them, who had perhaps suffered at their hands, or even participated in their banishment, the deep, secret fear was the outlaw's return. Banished men sometimes crept back, bringing not just their desperation, but vengeance and renewed fear, shattering the fragile peace of the village. You would hear the whispers first, a chilling rumor carried by a nervous peddler, or a frantic message from a neighboring hamlet. He's been seen near the old forest path. Or perhaps a more direct sign, a single, unusual track in the snow near the village perimeter, too large for a wolf, too stealthy for a mere traveller. A cold dread would begin to coil in your gut. The outlaw was usually a figure known to the village, a man from the community who had committed a serious crime, murder, arson, a heinous theft, and had been summarily banished by the Lord, sheriff, or by communal consensus. His banishment was meant to be permanent, a severance from all protection and sustenance. But desperation, fueled by hunger and cold, could drive even the most broken man back to his former haunts. His return was rarely a plea for mercy. More often, it was an act of vengeance. The outlaw carried a deep-seated resentment, a festering bitterness against those who had cast him out, those who had benefited from his absence, or perhaps those who had merely betrayed him. He knew the village intimately, its hidden paths, its weaknesses, the location of its meager stores, the routines of its families. This intimate knowledge made him a terrifying, personal threat. You would bar your door tighter, shutter your windows with renewed urgency, your eyes constantly scanning the shadows outside. The thought of him lurking in the dark, watching, waiting for a moment of vulnerability, was profoundly unsettling. The old feuds, the forgotten grievances, the past injustices, all would resurface, amplified by the terror of his presence. He might strike swiftly, silently, a stolen chicken from the byre, a sabotaged fence, a message, crude and terrifying, left at a doorway, or worse, a direct act of violence against a specific family, a brutal demonstration of his returned power, his unyielding desire for retribution. The village, already gripped by its usual fears, would now be consumed by a new, more personal terror. The children, sensing the heightened tension, would cling closer, their small faces reflecting the unspoken dread. They would hear the hushed conversations, the fearful warnings, and absorb the chilling reality of a man who had once been one of them, now transformed into a vengeful, dangerous shadow. The Lord's sheriff offered little protection against such a stealthy, personal threat. He might organize a search party, but the forest was vast and unforgiving, and the outlaw, familiar with its paths, would be like smoke in the trees. The villagers, themselves terrified, might be reluctant to actively pursue him, fearing his vengeance upon their families. The fragile peace of the village would be shattered. Suspicion, fear, and old resentments would rise to the surface, poisoning the communal bonds. The very air would feel heavy with the unseen menace, the knowledge that a vengeful shadow lurked just beyond the firelight. Banished men sometimes crept back, bringing vengeance and fear. The outlaw's return was a pervasive, fundamental fear for medieval peasants, a profound testament to the fragile nature of justice and the enduring power of personal grievance. It was a haunting reminder that in their isolated communities the past could always return to haunt them, shattering their hard-won security with violence and terror. and leaving them to grapple with both the visible and invisible threats to their lives. Illness and belief. The sudden fever. In the medieval peasant's hut where cold was pervasive, sanitation non-existent, and medical knowledge rudimentary, sickness was a constant, terrifying presence. But of all its forms, none struck with such chilling speed and profound fear as the sudden fever. Illness could strike without warning, turning a healthy body into a burning shell overnight, often claiming whole households in its relentless grip, leaving survivors to grapple with both profound grief and the terrifying mystery of its cause. You would be roused from a shallow, fitful sleep, not by a sound, but by the alarming heat radiating from a child beside you, their small body burning with an internal fire. Or perhaps your husband would stir, groaning softly, his face flushed and his brow clammy with sweat, his eyes dull and unfocused. The transition from health to devastating illness could be shockingly swift, a terrifying ambush in the quiet of the night. The hut, usually a sanctuary against the outside, now felt like a crucible of disease. In the cramped, smoky confines, where ventilation was sacrificed for warmth and bodies huddled close for survival, sickness spread with terrifying ease. A single fever could quickly descend into a wider contagion, claiming one family member after another, their collective warmth now a dangerous incubator for the invisible killer. The fever itself was a profound torment, a body burning with an internal fire, yet often shivering uncontrollably. The laboring breath, the flushed skin, the delirium that often accompanied high temperatures. These were the terrifying signs that filled the hearts of parents and spouses with despair. You would hold the feverish child close, trying to transfer your own meager warmth, or sponge their skin with cold river water, futile gestures against an invisible enemy. There was little effective medicine. The village healer, with her bundles of herbs and whispered spells, might offer a bitter tea or a foul-smelling poultice. The priest might administer last rites, his prayers offered to a god whose will seemed inscrutable. But often these remedies were more about hope and comfort than cure, offering little defense against the swift, brutal progression of the illness. The fear was palpable, profound. A sudden fever was rarely isolated. It could be the first sign of a more widespread pestilence, the prelude to the dreaded plague that might claim entire households. You would watch, terrified, for the telltale swellings, for the blackening of skin, for the signs that transformed fear into absolute despair. The illness of one person impacted the entire family. The sick needed tending, a constant drain on the already limited resources of time and energy. The fear of contagion was also present, even if poorly understood. Would the fever spread? Would it take hold of another? Every cough, every shiver, every unexplained ache became a source of renewed, agonizing anxiety. The long, dark hours of the night seemed to stretch interminably when someone was ill. The sounds of their suffering, the cries, the gasping breaths, the fevered moans, filled the hut, amplifying your own helplessness. The warmth of the fire, the collective warmth of bodies, felt insufficient against the internal cold of fever. The shadows cast by the dying embers seemed to deepen, taking on a more ominous quality, reflecting the despair that gnawed at the edges of your hope. Sickness struck without warning, often taking whole households. The sudden fever was a pervasive, fundamental fear for medieval peasants, a profound testament to their utter vulnerability to the whims of disease and the terrifying capriciousness of fate. It was a haunting reminder that in their world, life was a precarious, often losing battle against invisible enemies, and their fragile thread of existence could be snapped without warning, plunging families into profound grief and terrifying uncertainty. The midwife's burden. In the medieval peasants' world, where medical science was almost non-existent and the fragility of life a daily reality, childbirth was an ordeal fraught with immense peril. It was as feared as death itself, a journey into the unknown where lives trembled in the balance. When a new soul stirred to enter the world, particularly in the long dark hours of night, the midwife bore a heavy burden, a vigil of immense skill, profound faith, and desperate prayer, whispered at every birth, hoping to guide both mother and child through the perilous passage. The call would come in the deep of night, a frantic, hushed knock on your door, a whispered plea. You would rise, your stomach tightening with a familiar dread, grab your warmest cloak, and follow the nervous messenger through the dark, cold village. The hut where the birth was beginning would already be tense, filled with a palpable mixture of pain, fear, and desperate anticipation. Stepping inside, the air would be thick with the smell of wood smoke, sweat, and the distinct coppery tang of blood. The birthing woman, often your neighbor or a relative, would lie on a straw bed by the hearth, her face contorted in agony, her body racked by contractions. Other women, her family and close friends, would huddle nearby, murmuring prayers, offering comfort, but ultimately helpless. The midwife, however, was a force of quiet authority and calm competence. She was often an older woman, her hands gnarled by years of work, but her touch firm and knowing. Her face, etched with countless vigils, would be focused, her eyes sharp and constantly assessing. She carried a small pouch of vital, if humble, tools. Clean linen scraps, a sharp knife for the umbilical cord, and small bundles of herbs. Comfrey for pain, ergot for blood loss, chamomile for calming. Her knowledge was not from books, but from generations of lived experience, passed down through whispers and practical lessons. She would take charge, her low, steady voice cutting through the cries of the laboring woman and the hushed prayers of the onlookers. She would apply warm compresses, offer sips of herbal tea, encourage deep breaths. Her hands, though rough, moved with a surprising delicacy, guiding, supporting, monitoring the slow, arduous progress of the birth. The midwife's burden was immense, 2 lives, sometimes 3, trembling in her hands, her skill the only barrier against a swift, brutal end. The vigil would stretch for hours, sometimes through the entire night. The fire, kept burning as brightly as possible, cast dancing shadows that seemed to mock the profound struggle unfolding by its light. Each cry of the laboring woman, each gasp for breath, was a physical manifestation of the precarious balance between life and death. The air would be heavy with unspoken fear, with the desperate hope that both mother and child would survive. Childbirth in the Middle Ages was a journey fraught with immense danger. Infection, hemorrhage, prolonged labor. These were common killers, often claiming both mother and infant. The midwife knew these dangers intimately. She watched for the subtle signs, she made her desperate, often futile interventions, her knowledge the only barrier against a swift, brutal end. The whispered prayers of the women gathered would grow more fervent, blending with ancient charms and incantations meant to ward off evil spirits, to ensure an easy passage, to bless the new life. Faith and folk wisdom intertwined, a desperate attempt to exert some control over an event so profoundly beyond human command. And then, if God willed it, a new sound would pierce the night, a wail thin but insistent, the cry of a newborn. A collective gasp, then a deep, shuddering sigh of relief would ripple through the hut. The midwife, her face gleaming with sweat and exhaustion, would cradle the tiny, vulnerable form, carefully cutting the cord, cleaning the infant. Childbirth was as feared as death itself, with prayers whispered at every birth. The midwife's burden was a profound daily fear for medieval peasants, transforming the moment of new life into an intensely anxious vigil. It was a haunting reminder that in their world, life was a precarious, often losing battle, and even the most joyous of beginnings was shadowed by the ever-present threat of profound, agonizing loss. The evil eye. In the tightly woven, often superstitious world of the medieval peasant, where misfortune struck with bewildering randomness and the causes of sickness or crop failure were rarely understood, an insidious fear lurked beneath the surface of daily life. The evil eye. Peasants feared curses, charms, and their neighbors' envy as much as hunger or plague, believing that a malicious glance or a whispered word could bring calamity, a profound secret anxiety that poisoned communal trust and shaped their every interaction. The belief in the evil eye was ancient and pervasive, rooted deeply in folk culture, cutting across social strata, but particularly potent among the vulnerable peasant class. It was the conviction that certain individuals, either knowingly or unknowingly, possessed the power to inflict harm, illness, or bad luck simply by looking at another person or their possessions with envy, malice, or even excessive admiration. The fear was insidious because it was so hard to pinpoint, so hard to guard against. A neighbor might praise your thriving chicken or comment on your healthy child, and then a few days later the chicken would sicken or the child would fall ill. Such coincidences in a world desperate for explanations were immediately linked. The innocent compliment became a veiled curse, the admiring glance a malevolent eye. Suspicion, therefore, became a constant undercurrent in village life. You would learn to be cautious with your words, to avoid boasting of small fortunes, to deflect compliments with humble disclaimers. You would keep your gaze low, avoiding direct eye contact with those known or suspected to possess the evil eye. It was a subtle psychological dance, a constant negotiation with unseen threats. Certain individuals were particularly feared as potential bearers of the evil eye. Old women, often those living on the fringes of society, the eccentric, the solitary. These were easily identified as witches or those with innate malicious powers. A limping beggar, a stranger, with unusually bright eyes, or even a neighbor who bore an old grudge, could become a source of profound apprehension. To guard against the evil eye, peasants resorted to a host of protective charms and rituals. A small, crude crucifix worn around the neck or sewn into clothing, red thread tied around the wrist of a child or an animal believed to deflect the malevolent gaze. Specific herbs like rue or garlic carried in a pouch or hung above the door. These were not mere superstitions, they were vital, active defenses, tangible shields against an unseen but deeply feared force. When misfortune struck, a sudden blight on the crops, a cow that suddenly stopped giving milk, a child falling ill without explanation, the immediate question would often be, who could have cast the eye? The blame would fall swiftly, often silently, upon a suspected individual, leading to increased suspicion, social ostracism, or even accusations of witchcraft. The bonds of communal trust, already fragile, could be shattered by such fears. The air in the village, thick with wood smoke and the scent of daily life, was also heavy with unspoken anxieties. Every glance, every hushed conversation, every closed door held a double meaning. The fear of the evil eye was not just about physical harm, it was about the profound psychological toll of living in a world where even your neighbor's envy could be a weapon, where the lines between accident, illness, and deliberate malice were constantly blurred. Peasants feared curses, charms, and neighbors' envy as much as hunger. The evil eye was a pervasive, fundamental fear for medieval peasants, a profound testament to the power of superstition and the constant anxieties that permeated their daily lives. It was a haunting reminder that in their precarious world, dangers lurked not only in the wild or the distant city, but in the very heart of their own community, a secret, insidious threat to their fragile existence. The healer's herbs. In the medieval peasant's precarious world, where illness struck with bewildering speed and the looming spectre of death was a constant companion, the absence of proper medical knowledge left people profoundly vulnerable. Into this void stepped the village healer, a figure of vital importance and ancient wisdom. Hope lay in her bundles of plants and whispered spells, her herbs and charms a desperate, fragile defense against unseen threats, though even her cures were seldom enough against the relentless assault of sickness and fate. Her dwelling was often set slightly apart from the other huts, a small, sturdy structure whose walls were thick with mud and thatch. You would seek her out when a child burned with fever, when a persistent cough racked your husband, when a loved one grew weak from unexplained ailments. The journey to her door was often a desperate one, a last resort when all other prayers seemed to have gone unanswered. As you approached her hut, you might notice the carefully tended patch of earth beside it, even in the harshest seasons. Here, beneath a protective layer of straw or against a sunny wall, she cultivated her precious hardy herbs, bitter wormwood for fevers, soothing chamomile for troubled sleep, sharp garlic for infections, and a host of other plants whose names and properties were known only to her. The air around her dwelling often carried a complex aroma, the damp earth, the ever-present wood smoke, and the potent, sometimes pungent scent of drying herbs. Stepping inside her low-ceilinged hut, the air was warm, thick, and filled with a potent mixture of smells. Hanging from the rafters were bundles of dried herbs, their leaves rustling gently in the draughts. Small clay pots and wooden bowls lined shelves holding powders, salves, and infusions. Animal bladders, carefully sealed, contained viscous liquids or precious rendered fats. On a rough-hewn table, a mortar and pestle often sat, ready for the slow, rhythmic grinding of roots and leaves. The healer herself was often an older woman, her face a roadmap of hard-won experience. Her hands, though gnarled, moved with a surprising delicacy, her eyes sharp and knowing. She spoke little, but listened intently, her gaze piercing, taking in not just the symptoms, but the overall demeanor, the subtle signs of deeper distress. There was a quiet authority in her presence, born of generations of practical knowledge and an intimate understanding of the human body and the natural world. She would examine the ailing one with a gentle touch, feeling the heat of a forehead, listening to the wheeze of lungs, palpating a swollen limb. Her remedies were drawn from the earth around her, from the traditions passed down through her lineage. She might brew a bitter tea from specific roots or fashion a poultice from crushed leaves and warm mud. Her knowledge, though ancient, was their only defense. But her healing was not just of the body, it was also of the spirit. She understood the deep-seated fears that gripped people in this precarious world. She would murmur incantations, ancient blessings whispered over the smoky air, often blending Christian prayers with older, pagan charms that spoke to the deeper, primal fears of a pre-scientific age. She would offer amulets, a piece of consecrated wood, a smooth stone, a small bag of protective herbs, to be worn close to the skin, offering a vital psychological comfort against unseen threats. Her fee was always in kind, a measure of grain, a fresh egg if your hens were still laying, a piece of spun wool, or a promise of labor during harvest. Her service was essential, and though her remedies were often simple, they were all that stood between her people and the ravages of sickness. Sometimes she succeeded, A fever would break, a cough would subside, a life would be saved. These were celebrated as small miracles, reinforcing her status and the community's fragile hope. More often, she failed, not through lack of effort or knowledge, but because the illnesses were too severe. The bodies too weakened by chronic hunger and cold, the knowledge too incomplete against the onslaught of disease and fate. She would sit by the dying, offering comfort and prayers, her face etched with a quiet sorrow, understanding that some battles could not be won. Her role was also to ease the passage, to provide what small dignity she could in the face of inevitable death. Hope lay in bundles of plants and whispered spells against unseen threats. The healer herbs were a profound testament to humanity, as enduring struggle to understand and master its own vulnerabilities. Her quiet strength and ancient remedies were the only defense against the invisible enemies that lurked in the damp earth, in the cold air, in the very fabric of life itself, providing a glimmer of light in the overwhelming shadows of despair, though cures were seldom enough. The tolling bell. In the vast, often terrifying silence of the medieval night, when the world outside the peasant's hut was a realm of profound darkness and unquantifiable fears, sound carried with startling clarity. And few sounds held such potent, immediate meaning as the distant tolling of a bell, each chime, slow and mournful, echoing through the cold, still air, was a stark, chilling pronouncement. It was the deepest, most personal fear. Each funeral bell reminded villagers of their own fragile thread of life, a constant, pervasive whisper of mortality. You would be deep in the fitful sleep of exhaustion, perhaps finally finding a brief reprieve from the cold or hunger when it would begin. A solitary chime. Then, after a long, agonizing pause, another and another. Slow, deliberate. Each sound vibrated through the very earth, penetrating the thick walls of your hut, gripping your heart with a cold, unrelenting dread. The bell was no longer a comforting sound, it was an alarm, a death knell, a messenger of misfortune. Your eyes would snap open, your heart immediately pounding a heavy rhythm against your ribs. Your husband beside you would stir, his breath held, his face a grim mask in the near-total darkness. The children, if they woke, would whimper softly, sensing the palpable fear that had instantly filled the hut. The bell's message was clear. Death had visited the village again. The bell was not your own. Few peasant villages possessed such a luxury. It would belong to the nearest parish church or monastery, perhaps a day's walk away. Its sound, carried by the cold, still air of the night, spoke of a larger world, a larger community, but also of shared, overwhelming vulnerability. The number of tolls was often significant. 3 tolls, perhaps, for a child, 9 for an adult, a prolonged, frantic pealing for fire, or a widespread disaster. The meaning was usually understood, even if the precise nature of the tragedy remained a terrifying mystery until dawn. The sound itself was enough to conjure images of suffering, a body racked by fever, a life lost to a sudden accident, a soul taken too soon. You would lie absolutely motionless, straining your ears into the profound quiet that followed each chime. The silence between the tolls felt immense, heavy, filled with unspoken questions and terrifying possibilities. Who had it claimed? Which family had been struck anew by loss? What fresh misfortune had visited itself upon the community now? The cold of the night would feel sharper, more insidious, imbued with the terror of the bell's message. The warmth of the banked fire, the collective warmth of bodies, would seem suddenly insufficient against the chilling pronouncement of death. The shuttered walls of the hut, usually a sanctuary, now felt porous, allowing the dread to seep in, unchecked. Your husband might rise, restless and uneasy. He would move to the door, his hand on the heavy bar, listening intently into the night. His vigil was one of helpless apprehension, a shared burden with every other family in the village. There was nothing to be done in the deep darkness, no way to ascertain the specific tragedy until the light of day, only to listen and to wait. The children, if they asked, would be soothed with vague, whispered reassurances, but the fear in your own voice would be hard to disguise. Their small minds would struggle to comprehend the grim message, but their bodies would register the pervasive anxiety of their parents. After what felt like an eternity, the tolls would cease, leaving behind an even deeper, more profound silence. But the memory of the sound, its chilling message, would linger, making any further sleep shallow and restless. The hut would remain shrouded in darkness, but it was a darkness now tinged with a fresh layer of sorrow and apprehension. Each funeral bell reminded villagers of their own fragile thread of life. The tolling bell was a profound communal pronouncement of mortality, a stark reminder of the secret fears of everyday medieval peasants. It underscored the immense precarity of life, a chilling soundtrack to a world where sickness, danger, and death were constant companions, and where every chime brought a fresh wave of dread, reinforcing their profound vulnerability. Night whispers. The barred door. As the sun, a tired eye, finally dipped below the distant line of fields and the familiar landscape of daily toil surrendered to the pervasive gloom, a profound transformation occurred for the medieval peasant. The world outside the hut, once a source of visible challenges, now became a realm of profound uncertainty and amplified dread. One of the deepest, most persistent fears was the vulnerability of their home, and thus the most vital, primal act of defense was the barred door. Wood and iron, however humble, were poor shields against the cunning of thieves or the malevolent whispers of spirits in the dark. You would stand at the low, rough-hewn doorway of your hut, watching the last sliver of daylight vanish, feeling the familiar tightening in your gut. The air, which had held a tenuous warmth during the day, now sharpened, carrying the biting chill that heralded the coming of a long, brutal night. The shadows which had clung to the edges of the forest now stretched long and indistinct, creeping out to claim the fields, the paths, and eventually the very thresholds of your village. The world outside, once a busy tableau of communal life, slowly emptied. Villagers rushed to finish their last chores, their movements hurried, their faces grimly focused. Animals were coaxed into their byres, windows, often just crude openings, were shuttered tight. Each act was a silent acknowledgement of the night's dangers, a desperate effort to draw the fragile boundaries between safety and peril. Your husband would move with grim determination. The heavy plank of wood that served as the primary door would be retrieved, its surface scarred and worn. With a grunting effort, he would wedge it into place, fitting it tightly into the rough frame, a declaration of fragile defiance. The sound of the wood slotting into place was a heavy thud, deliberate and final. Then, from inside, he would slide the sturdy wooden bar across, a thick branch smoothed by use, fitting it into two deep notches on either side of the doorframe. The metallic scrape of iron on wood, as a bolt was drawn or a latch secured, would echo in the sudden quiet of the hut. These were ancient, primal acts, mechanical prayers to wood and iron, hoping against hope that they possessed the power to repel the unseen dangers. But the fear was deep-seated. Thieves, desperate men driven by hunger or greed, used the cover of darkness to prey on the vulnerable. They knew the weakness of a peasant's hut, the limits of its crude defenses. A heavy plank, a simple bar, these were meager deterrents against determined men. The fear of a sudden, violent intrusion of losing your meager possessions, your animals, or even your life was a constant, gnawing anxiety that kept sleep shallow and restless. And beyond the tangible threat of thieves, there was the more insidious fear of spirits. The night, in medieval belief, was the domain of malevolent forces, of mischievous fairies, of witches, and of restless ghosts. It was believed that spirits could enter the hut through cracks, that witches could cast curses under the cloak of darkness, bringing illness, bad luck, or even death. Wood and iron were poor shields against such ethereal invaders. You would lie on your straw bed, huddled close to your family, wrapped in your rough woolen blanket, listening intently. Your husband beside you would stir, his hand instinctively reaching for the heavy cudgel or axe kept close by. His vigilance was a shared burden, an unspoken worry that hung in the thick, smoky air. The profound silence outside was often more terrifying than any specific noise. It was an empty, vast silence, full of unspoken possibilities, broken only by the distant hoot of an owl or the sharp bark of a village dog, its alarm a chilling confirmation of something unseen moving in the shadows. Wood and iron were poor shields against thieves or spirits in the dark. The barred door was a profound, fundamental fear for medieval peasants, transforming their humble dwelling into a vulnerable fortress, and their sleep into a state of perpetual vigilance. It was a haunting reminder that in their world, safety was a fragile construct, perpetually threatened by both the harsh realities of human cruelty and the terrifying mysteries of the unseen world. The wolf's cry, of all the sounds that pierced the profound, snow-muffled stillness of the medieval night, few could grip the peasant's heart with such primal terror as the cry of wolves. In a world where the wilderness pressed close against human settlements and hunger sharpened the desperation of both man and beast, wolves were not distant creatures of legend, but a very real, very present danger. Howls across the fields froze hearts and silenced villages, a chilling symphony that spoke of ancient fears and immediate, visceral peril, reminding every peasant of their fragile place in the food chain. You would be deep in a restless sleep, perhaps dreaming of the day's endless toil when it would begin. A solitary howl, long and drawn out, a mournful lament that seemed to rise from the very depths of the dark forest, carried on the cold night air. Then a pause, a tense silence, before another joined, and then another, until a chilling chorus echoed across the fields through the very walls of your hut. Your eyes would snap open, instantly alert, your heart hammering against your ribs. Every muscle would tense, your husband beside you would stir, a low growl escaping his throat, his eyes wide and alert in the darkness. The children, perhaps, would whimper softly, roused by the sudden, unsettling noise, pulling closer to the perceived safety of their parents' bodies. Even the animals in their byre, usually restless, would fall silent, their senses acutely tuned to the distant danger, their collective stillness almost more terrifying than the howls themselves. The cries were not just sounds, they were a declaration of hunger, a symbol of the untamed wilderness reclaiming its domain. Wolves were a constant, tangible threat to the peasants' meager livestock, the precious sheep, the invaluable goat, even the scrawny cow. A single successful raid could spell disaster for a family, stealing away a crucial source of wool, milk, and future sustenance. In a lean winter, their desperation mirrored and often surpassed your own. You would lie absolutely still, straining your ears, trying to discern the nuances in the howling. Were they far off, a distant warning? Or were they closer, too close, circling the edges of the village, their keen senses already scenting the warmth of the animals, the presence of vulnerable life? The wind, if it blew from the forest, seemed to carry their chilling calls directly into the hut, making them feel even more immediate, more menacing. The fire, reduced to its faintest embers, offered no real light against such a primal darkness, no warmth against such a bone-deep fear. The barred door, the thick walls, they felt suddenly fragile, insufficient against the ancient predatory intelligence that lurked outside. Your husband would rise slowly, carefully, his movements hushed. He would move to the door, his hand resting on the heavy wooden bar, his ear pressed against the rough timber. He would listen, his breath held, trying to discern any subtle shift in the sounds, the soft pad of paws on snow, the rustle of dry leaves, the sudden, frantic bleat of a distant animal. The cudgel or axe kept close by would be gripped tight, its cold weight a small, grim comfort. The children, if they were truly awake, would stare wide-eyed into the darkness, their small imaginations filling the vast night with monstrous forms. You would pull them closer, murmuring reassurances, though your own heart was often filled with the same unease. The fear was infectious, a cold, creeping sensation that settled in the pit of your stomach. Sometimes the howling would recede, fading back into the deep forest, leaving behind a profound, almost echoing silence. A collective sigh of relief, often unspoken, would ripple through the hut. The immediate threat had passed, for now. Howls across the fields froze hearts and silenced villages. The wolf's cry was a pervasive, fundamental fear for medieval peasants, a profound testament to their utter vulnerability to the untamed wilderness. It was a haunting reminder that in their world, the boundaries between human and wild were thin, and the threat of primal violence was always lurking, defining the secret fears that haunted their long, dark nights. The fires fade. In the medieval peasant's hut, the hearth fire was the very heartbeat of existence, the sole source of warmth, light, and comfort against the overwhelming darkness and cold of the night. It was meticulously tended, its embers carefully banked to ensure its survival until dawn. But for all their efforts, one of the deepest, most insidious fears was the fire's fade. If flames died before dawn, cold could creep in and kill, turning the fragile sanctuary of the hut into a tomb, a chilling reminder of the constant, intimate battle against the elements. You would be roused from a shallow, fitful sleep, not by a sound, but by the sheer, intense bite of the cold. The hut, usually cold even with a fire, would now be utterly frigid, the air heavy with an icy stillness. Your breath, when you exhaled, would plume in dense white clouds, lingering for what felt like an eternity before dissipating into the profound chill. Your heart would clench with a sudden, sickening dread. You would immediately turn towards the hearth, straining your eyes in the absolute darkness, where there should have been a faint orange glow, a tiny, resilient spark. There was only blackness. The embers had died. The fire had faded. The most vital defense against the lethal cold of the night was gone. A profound sense of panic, quiet and internal, would grip you. The cold, which had been a persistent nuisance, now became a deadly enemy. It seeped up from the damp earth floor, radiated inwards from the mud-daubed walls, and descended from the ill-fitting thatch of the roof. It found every exposed patch of skin, every gap in your rough woolen blankets, threatening to steal the very warmth from your body, to claim the lives of your family. Your husband, beside you, would also stir, sensing the profound change. A low groan would escape his lips, his hand instinctively reaching for the hearth, only to meet cold ash. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with unspoken fears, with the terrifying knowledge of their vulnerability. The children, nestled close, would begin to stir, their small bodies shivering uncontrollably, their whimpers growing more distressed. You would pull them closer, burrowing deeper into the straw, but the collective warmth of bodies felt insufficient, a rapidly diminishing resource against the overwhelming chill. The effort to rekindle a dead fire in absolute darkness and extreme cold was immense, often futile. Flint and steel, tinder, kindling, these had to be found by touch, their placement precise. Fingers, numb with cold, would fumble, making the delicate task even harder. The hope of striking a spark, of coaxing a flame back from nothing, felt like a desperate gamble against overwhelming odds. The sounds of the hut would be muted, desperate, the chattering of teeth, the soft sobs of children, the heavy, shallow breathing of those trying to conserve warmth. The minutes would stretch into an eternity, each one bringing the creeping numbness of hypothermia closer. The shadows which had danced with the firelight now felt like a suffocating blanket, pressing down, threatening to extinguish all life. If flames died before dawn, cold could creep in and kill. The fire's fade was a pervasive, fundamental fear for medieval peasants, a profound testament to their utter vulnerability to the elements and the relentless battle for warmth. It was a haunting reminder that in their world, the survival of their family hinged on a single, precious spark, and its extinguishing was a terrifying harbinger of suffering, sickness, and the very real possibility of death in the chilling darkness of the night. The dream's omen. In the medieval peasant's hut, sleep was rarely a time of profound peace. It was a fragile, restless commodity, punctuated by cold, hunger, and the constant anxieties of survival. But even when exhaustion claimed them, the mind offered no true escape. Dreams were not dismissed as fleeting fancies. They were taken as potent warnings, messages from the spirit world, omens of sickness, death, or divine judgment to come. The boundary between the waking world and the realm of the nocturnal mind was thin, permeable, and often filled with terrifying portents. You would stir from a nightmare, your heart pounding, your body slick with a cold sweat, a silent scream caught in your throat. The hut would be in absolute darkness, the embers long since faded to nothing. The familiar shapes of your sleeping family would be indistinct, and for a terrifying moment, the oppressive gloom would seem to hold the spectral forms of your dream. The dream itself would be vivid, chilling in its detail. Perhaps you saw a beloved child, their face pale and lifeless, lying cold on the straw. Or a shadowy figure, cloaked and menacing, lurking at the edge of the forest, its eyes burning with malevolence. Maybe you dreamt of a blighted crop, fields rotting, or the terrifying sight of your hut consumed by fire. These were not random images. They were believed to be visitations, communications from forces beyond human understanding. In a world deeply intertwined with Christian belief, but also retaining strong undercurrents of older pagan faiths and superstitions, dreams were often seen as battlegrounds. Demons, spirits, and malevolent fairies could invade the sleeping mind, planting seeds of fear, tempting the soul, or delivering dire warnings. The devil himself was thought to roam most freely in the hours of deepest darkness, his influence reaching even into the sanctuary of sleep. You would lie still, trembling, trying to shake off the lingering tendrils of the nightmare. The images would burn behind your eyelids, refusing to dissipate. The cold of the night would feel sharper, more menacing, imbued with the terror of your dream. The sounds of the hut, the rustle of straw, the occasional creak of timber would seem amplified, imbued with a sinister meaning. Whispering a hurried prayer, you might cross yourself or clutch a small, crude crucifix hidden beneath your blanket. Perhaps you would reach for a protective charm, a piece of consecrated wood, or a dried herb, hoping its power would ward off the lingering evil of the dream. The sense of vulnerability was profound. Even in sleep, you were not safe. When dawn finally broke, casting its pale light into the hut, the dream would still cling to you, its shadow refusing to lift. You would share it perhaps with your husband, or with the village healer, or even with the priest if he was visiting. The telling of the dream was an important ritual, a way to externalize the fear, to seek interpretation and solace. The healer might offer an explanation rooted in the body's humors, or a specific herbal draught to promote more peaceful sleep. The priest might interpret it as a temptation, a test of faith, or a divine warning requiring extra prayer or penance. But all would agree the dream was not to be taken lightly. It held meaning. The lingering fear of a bad dream could cast a pall over the entire day. You would watch your children more closely, inspect your meager harvest with a renewed sense of anxiety, and regard any unexpected visitor with heightened suspicion. The dream, once dismissed, now held a potent sway over your waking hours, shaping your actions, fueling your anxieties. Dreams were taken as warnings of sickness, death, or divine judgment. The dream's omen was a pervasive, fundamental fear for medieval peasants, transforming their sleep into a realm of profound apprehension. It was a haunting reminder that in their precarious world, dangers lurked not only in the tangible world, but also in the unseen realms of the spirit, defining the secret fears that haunted their long, dark nights and shaped their desperate quest for survival. The morning's fragile hope, the cock's crow, ragged and defiant, had long since faded into the brightening air. The profound darkness of the medieval night, which had pressed so heavily against the hut's fragile walls, was finally giving way to the pale, bruised light of dawn. The world outside, revealed in stark, unforgiving detail, was still cold, still challenging, but it was no longer the realm of unseen terrors. You had endured another night, and with each sunrise a fragile hope emerged, but also the same quiet fears waiting to resurface. You moved with the familiar, protesting rhythm of the newly awakened peasant. The fire, painstakingly coaxed back to life, now offered a tentative warmth, its smoke curling lazily towards the smoke hole in the roof. The meager breakfast of coarse bread and thin ale was consumed in quiet resignation. The animals in their byre stirred, their lowing and clucking a familiar backdrop to the morning's quiet industry. Your body, stiff and aching from the cold and the restless turns on the straw bed, slowly began to respond to the demands of the day. Your hands, calloused and rough, reached for tools, for water, for the children's eager, demanding hands. There was no exhilaration in this survival, no joyous celebration, only a deep-seated, quiet determination, a profound acceptance of the relentless cycle. As the sun, a pale, weak disk, finally edged above the distant fields, casting long, distorted shadows across the awakening landscape, a subtle transformation occurred. The external world, which had been so menacing in the darkness, now became navigable. The winding paths, the silent ruins, the edge of the forest. These were no longer amorphous threats, but tangible landscapes demanding your relentless labor. The barred door, which had been a symbol of defense against the night, was now unbarred, pushed open to allow the precious daylight in. The bitter wind still whispered, carrying the sharp scent of frost and damp earth, but its chill felt less insidious in the light. The long, cold hours of darkness, with their fears of wolves, spirits, and thieves, had passed. Your children, once huddled in the deepest sleep, were now awake, their small faces animated by the promise of the day, their small hands reaching for the meager breakfast. Their resilience was a constant source of wonder, a testament to the human spirit's capacity to adapt and endure. You would step out of the hut, perhaps to fetch water from the well or to tend to the animals. The morning air would bite at your exposed skin, but the sun's hesitant light on your face was a small, vital comfort. You would survey the village, noting the other plumes of smoke rising from neighbors' hut, a collective affirmation that they too had endured. The occasional call of another peasant, or the distant barking of a dog, would serve as a reminder of the enduring community, a fragile network of shared survival. The tasks of the day, familiar and unyielding, would quickly take hold. The ploughing, the sowing, the foraging for firewood, the mending of clothes, the endless, repetitive cycle of work would begin anew. There was no time for reflection, no space for lingering over the fears of the past night or the uncertainties of the future. Survival demanded constant, immediate action. Yet, beneath the surface of this relentless toil, an unspoken understanding persisted. Each sunrise carried relief, but also the same quiet fears waiting. The fear of the night's return, the dread of hunger, the vulnerability to sickness, the arbitrary demands of the Lord, the threat of bandits, the unpredictable whims of nature, the malevolent eye of a neighbor, the lingering memory of loss. These were the secret fears that defined their existence. The morning's fragile hope was a testament to the unyielding resilience of medieval peasants. They lived their lives perpetually shadowed by these unspoken anxieties, but with each new dawn they found the strength to rise, to work, and to endure. Their survival was not a guarantee but a hard-won daily victory, an endless cycle where the fragile hope of a new day constantly battled against the same quiet fears, waiting patiently for the cloak of night to descend once more.